The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, regarded by many as the single greatest video game ever made, is a title that I've wanted to cover for a number of years at this point, as, pretty unbelievably, it's a game that despite all of its lofty achievements and fame, I've somehow never played until now, with it, slipping me by over the past couple of decades. While I did own a Nintendo 64 back in the day, having games such as GoldenEye 007, Banjo-Kazooie, plus my personal favourite Diddy Kong Racing, I eventually swapped out my N64 for a PlayStation at the back end of 1998 with all of those half-price platinum titles on offer for the little grey box, games such as Final Fantasy VII, Resident Evil, Tekken and so on, simply proving too hard to resist. While the gap between me trading in my N64 and the release of Ocarina of Time was only about a couple of weeks, those weeks eventually turned into months, those months turned into years, and those years inevitably turned into decades, as the title I'd always meant to get around to play somehow kept getting further and further away. Today, however, I will rectify that mistake, and with the new remake of the game revealed earlier this year also, I thought now was the perfect opportunity to finally go back and play through The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Metacritic's #1 game of all time, as I endeavour to find out why this game was, and still is, so critically acclaimed by both critics and fans alike. Now, far from this just being my first playthrough of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time itself, this is actually my first time playing any Zelda game, period, so I was really excited about getting stuck in here and seeing why this franchise is so beloved by its fans, especially jumping in at arguably its crowning moment. Ocarina of Time had a bit of a topsy-turvy development history throughout most of the 1990s. The game was initially developed alongside Super Mario 64, right at the beginning of the N64's life cycle, with its very first demo being shown all the way back at Space World 1995, a demo that showed off a very different design and concept than what we eventually ended up with in the finished game. With a staff of over 200 people, plus a sizable budget of $12 million behind it as well, Zelda 64, as it was then known, was a title that Nintendo had placed firmly alongside Mario as a flagship franchise for the system, and one it had high hopes for as a result. However, with the imminent launch of the N64 fast approaching, focus shifted from Zelda entirely onto Mario, making sure that it was ready to go for its mid-1996 release date. That left Zelda somewhat on the sidelines for a while, with a proposed release for Nintendo's ill-fated 64DD disc drive being floated instead, a peripheral developed specifically to expand the capabilities of the N64. While the 64DD could no doubt be considered a bit of a pioneer in the games industry, having a real-time clock installed, having the functionality to share movies and media online, as well as having an e-commerce system set up, it was discontinued after just a short time in Japan, registering as a pretty big commercial failure with no releases in either Europe or the US either. This meant that Zelda had to be redeveloped back onto cartridge with the system's paltry 16 megabyte capacity, meaning that initial concepts had Zelda 64 playing very much like Mario 64, containing a central hub, Ganondorf's castle in this case, with the player having to teleport through paintings or other devices to access levels. This initial design concept can still be seen in some of the areas of the game as well, most notably in the Phantom Ganon boss battle in the Forest Temple, but given the overall scope and ambition that the designers had for this game, this idea was quickly scrapped as the team wanted to push the N64 to its absolute limits, doubling capacity to 32 megabytes, making it, at that point at least, the largest game ever released for the N64. All of that extra space certainly didn't go to waste either, as Ocarina of Time absolutely revolutionized the entire adventure game genre, with a testament to all of its design and mechanical innovations being that now, almost 30 years later, games are still utilising its design concepts. When Ocarina of Time finally released at the end of 1998, the game received critical and almost universal acclaim, with numerous publications awarding it a perfect score, 10 out of 10, while Jeff Gerstmann of GameSpot called it flawless. However, not one to let third-party reviews influence me. I want to finally put my own, definitive stamp on this game and find out once and for all if it is indeed the greatest game of all time, almost 3 decades after its initial release. Before diving headlong into The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, I just want to take this opportunity to give a quick shout out to everyone who continues to support the channel by liking and subscribing to the videos. It's always a massive help, and with that said, now let's get back to the video. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time starts out in some pretty dramatic fashion, with young Link having a nightmare, witnessing a man in black armour pursuing a young girl on horseback. The intensity of this scene is great, showing you in effect what's at stake. And the transition from that to then Navi flying, casually about the forest. I thought the contrast between the two was really well done, kind of setting up the distinction between the two worlds in the game that we'll later go on to see, that being childhood Link's world versus adult Link's. I say Link, but in reality his name's RetroHauler for this playthrough, or at least it would be if I could manage to fit in all the characters.
You suck!
After a brief training and tutorial area where we can pick up some wooden weapons, it's off to see the Great Deku Tree, who has a very important message for young Link, but not before having to negotiate our way past this little John Wick dipshit Mido first. It turns out that the Great Deku Tree has been cursed by who he refers to at least as a wicked man of the desert, and Link is supposedly the only one that can lift the curse. This is in effect our first dungeon of the game, a tutorial dungeon so to speak, and one that does a great job of covering almost, every mechanic that we'll need for the rest of the game. This mechanical functionality to me is easily Ocarina of Time's greatest strength as a video game, and one of the main reasons this game is still held in such high regard today. On a side note, I was recently playing through Assassin's Creed Origins for a small bit, a game that I'm not particularly fond of in all honesty, but just to highlight the point, I can honestly say that the control and lock-on scheme in Ocarina of Time is better than AC Origins, better than a game almost 20 years its junior, and that's just a huge testament to how groundbreaking The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was, especially at the time of its release. These design features, which, included the aforementioned lock-on mechanic that, we'd never even seen in a video game before, much less experienced, also included the situational context sensitive A button as well, which changes and shifts functions depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The ability to go from third person to first person almost seamlessly as well. This game pretty much single-handedly revolutionized the entire industry, never mind just the adventure game genre itself, across multiple different areas. And it's fair to say that a lot of what we take for granted today in modern gaming, at least as far as control mechanics go, we owe to this game, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Once inside the Great Deku Tree itself, you'll be able to pick up your first range weapon of the game, the Fairy Slingshot, which is only available to young Link, and a weapon he needs to defeat the parasitic boss of this dungeon, Goma, the Arachnid Queen. I knew going into Ocarina of Time that, look, it wasn't exactly Dark Souls at the end of the day, but even so, I was a little surprised how easy it was to take out Goma here, on my very first try. I did think she put up a bit more of a fight, in all honesty, as, pro gamer I most certainly am not. Beating Goma gives us the Sacred Stone of the Forest, which the Great Deku Tree tells us to take to Princess Zelda in Hyrule Castle before then promptly dying.
The tree is dying. Oh, too late.
Again, just like the start of the game, the scene of Link leaving Kokiri Forest is really well directed in my opinion, and the facial animations of some of these characters, especially for an N64 cartridge, as they try to convey emotions, is honestly pretty astonishing, and I'm not even sure how they managed to do it in all honesty. You can pretty much read the entire scene from just the characters' faces alone, and that's, really, really impressive stuff for a game released all the way back in 1998. Getting out into the big wide world of Hyrule itself, and the sense of scale you get when you first leave Kokiri Forest, is simply breathtaking. The world genuinely feels enormous, even today. And this was years before the likes of, GTA San Andreas and Shadow of the Colossus came along, showing that, what Shigeru Miyamoto and the team were able to squeeze out here in terms of sense of scale is, genuinely awe-inspiring stuff. Reaching Hyrule Market, and look, it's fair to say that the pre-rendered backgrounds on offer here weren't exactly the N64 strong suit, especially up against its PlayStation brethren, but, as they're not too widely used throughout the game, it's really only in and around Hyrule Castle that we see them. It never becomes much of an issue. On a side note, the way this guard just watches us trash this place and does absolutely nothing to stop us, it's no wonder Ganondorf just completely rolls over this army.
Besides, the army's weak.
There are a few different activities we can get up to at this point before getting into the story proper, namely some target practice for upgrades, dog hunting for a woman who has lost her pet, plus some chicken chasing over at Lon Lon Ranch as well. But to be honest, I didn't particularly find any of these activities either rewarding or fun. You know, The Witcher 3, this most certainly isn't, and it's a shame that, to me at least, the side questing in Ocarina of Time does, fall a long way short of what's offered in the main game. Arguably an even bigger issue here than just the side questing in this game is the aiming mechanic, as these two are frequently combined together as well, with numerous shops plus, other areas of the game offering target practice mini games for prizes and upgrades. The issue here is that, the game really isn't optimized for precise aiming. The N64 controller's dead zones and fidgety sensitivity mean, aiming was honestly a bit of a chore. While it never quite gets in the way of actually completing the game, there were some genuinely frustrating and almost game-breaking moments for me in Ocarina of Time. One part in particular during the Water Temple section where you have to hit an ice switch with an arrow and then quickly pull yourself across with the hookshot before the gate closes, roughly a 3 or so second gap. And I honestly thought that it might be the end of my run. The gap was so short and I was stuck there for about 45 minutes doing the same segment over and over again before finally managing to get lucky and clipping through the gate as I went across. This frustration, as I said, extends into the mini games as well, with the aiming mechanic for their completion being far too undercooked for me again. Doable, but are you really going to put yourself through all that frustration to upgrade your bullet bag from, 20 to 40 or double the number of Deku nuts you can carry? Probably not. Returning to the main quest, our mission to meet up with Princess Zelda has us sneaking through the castle gardens, with our capture at this point by the guards getting us thrown out and having to start all over again.
Get out and stay out!
Once we make it into the courtyard itself, the princess fills us in a bit more of the backstory that the Great Deku Tree showed us earlier and tells us that we must acquire 2 more of the sacred spiritual stones that will finally enable us to gain access to the sacred realm, something Ganondorf is eager to do. Also, our first sighting of the nefarious Ganondorf happens at this point of the game as well, with Link spying him through the castle window in, yet again a scene that, is really well directed. Before we can leave the castle, Impa, Zelda's bodyguard, teaches us the song Zelda's Lullaby, which is easily the most popular tune in the entire game. Speaking of the Ocarina itself, it's hard to cover an Ocarina of Time game and not talk about the eponymous instrument itself. This is what the game is named after all, and it's a mechanic that just feels so natural to the game. Doesn't particularly feel noteworthy in any particular regard, which is probably the highest praise I can offer it, as despite it being such unique an inimitable feature of the game, we'd never seen anything like it before. It just fits in so perfectly with everything else around it that it barely stands out at all. Our first stop on our journey to pick up the second of the spiritual stones is to head up Death Mountain to the land of the Gorons, a tribe of rock people, in order to collect their ruby. This journey to Death Mountain takes us through Kakariko Village, where I engaged in probably one of the main side quests of the game, the Happy Mask trading sequence, but, just as in a lot of the other side quests in the game, it effectively goes nowhere despite its fairly lengthy duration, with, its main payoff at the end being the ability to talk to some stones for hints, an almost useless reward that isn't needed whatsoever to complete the main story, and just another reason why I believe that the side questing in Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, does leave a lot to be desired. The one big advantage of this early Kakariko Village trip, however, is the ability to pick up the Hylian shield, a shield which, we'll be using for most of the rest of the game. Arriving at Goron City, which is located about halfway up the mountain, we eventually encounter the leader of the Gorons, Darunia, who is lamenting over the loss of their sacred cavern, a loss they endured to the Dodongos, a race of fire-breathing lizard creatures. Darunia begs us for our help, telling us to head to the Dodongo's Cavern, our second main dungeon of the game, which will see us take on a variety of new enemies, as well as pick up some new equipment also in the highly useful bomb flowers. Once we make it through the dungeon itself, King Dodongo awaits, the boss of this area, who despite its impressive size, is another extremely easy boss to defeat, basically having only one main rolling attack that you need to watch out for, with his fire-breathing attack never becoming much of an issue, unless you're incredibly slow at counter-attacking him by lobbing a bomb into his mouth. That said, while the King Dodongo boss fight is fairly straightforward, it's still incredibly impressive from a technical standpoint. I remember when video game magazines of the time were running previews and features of Ocarina of Time, pretty much constantly throughout 1998. And the King Dodongo screenshots in particular absolutely blew me and, pretty much everyone else at the time away. No one was doing this kind of, massive sense of scale stuff, and it still genuinely feels impressive to this day.
So, you're a big boy, aren't you?
Warping outside to the exterior of the dungeon sees Darunia offer us his sacred Goron Ruby, the second of the sacred stones, and advises us to go even further up the mountain in order to meet the first of the great fairies. There are 6 great fairy fountains spread throughout the game, and these are quite possibly the best locations in the entire game as a result, always placed in out-of-the-way spots, but well worth seeking out, as each of the fairies will boost Link's magical and attack power abilities by a pretty significant margin, and while only finding one is strictly required to complete the game, it's well worth finding all 6, as you'll always gain something incredibly useful from them. The first of these great fairies, located, as we said, near the top of Death Mountain, will offer us a Magic Meter plus a super spin attack as well, which adds far greater damage and range to our basic attack. But, despite the extremely useful prize on offer, the fairy's dress sense and sound design could, definitely use some work.
What the fuck was that?
Once back at the bottom in Kakariko Village, I made my first visit to the House of Skulltula, a cursed home that genuinely feels quite unsettling, with these spider-like creatures with human faces dropping down from the ceiling. Turns out these spider-like beings have been cursed, with the only way to seemingly break it being for someone to collect all 100 gold Skulltula tokens. No mean feat, which are scattered throughout the game. This is one of the better side quests, in fairness, mainly because of the rewards on offer, giant wallets, rumble features for secrets, pieces of heart and so on, but it's still far from ideal, as the quest offers rewards for every 10 tokens that you collect from 10 to 50, yet then there's basically no reward from 50 to 100, meaning, it sucks a lot of the motivation to go out and complete the last 50 tokens, unless you're some die-hard completionist. So, due to that, I only ended up collecting 73 tokens myself, as, I really didn't have the incentive to go out and hunt down the final 27 tokens in obscure locations, especially for a reward that I wasn't even sure would be worth it in the end. Once everything's been resolved on the mountain, as well as in Kakariko Village, it's off to find the Sacred Stone of Water, located in Zora's domain, which will finally allow us to open up the gateway to the Sacred Realm. The Zoras are a race of fish-like beings whose king is searching for his missing daughter Ruto. On the way there, we come across the second of the Great Fairy Fountains, which is located near Hyrule Castle. The fairy here, which you'll need the bombs we acquired from Death Mountain in order to access, gives us the power of Din's Fire, a really useful spell which will light pretty much everything on fire in the immediate vicinity around us. On the way to Zora's domain, we bump into some frogs who will pay us a nice sum of gold actually just to play our ocarina for them, as well as a magic bean salesman also who will sell us increasingly expensive magic beans, which we can plant as young Link and then take advantage of as adult Link, with the leaf sprouts they produce eventually giving us access to some high value rewards later in the game. Also in the area around Lake Hylia, we can discover 2 scarecrows who, if we play a song for them, a song of the player's own choosing, one of the scarecrows will come back later on and help us as adult Link. A feature which, is only really useful if you intend on collecting all 100 of the gold Skulltula tokens or, pieces of heart. We can also partake in a fishing minigame around Lake Hylia as well, but, let's just say that this did little to change my mind in regards to the minigames on offer. Finding a message from the princess in a bottle at the bottom of the lake, it turns out that the young princess Ruto has been swallowed whole by the great demigod Jabu Jabu while looking for her ring. Luckily for us, located right next to Jabu Jabu's gaping maw is the third of the Great Fairy Fountains, whose host gives us the highly useful Furor's Wind spell, another highly useful mark and recall incantation that can cut out a lot of the needless backtracking when traversing dungeons. Jabu Jabu's Belly is arguably, one of the more imaginative and tricky dungeons in the game, with various parasitic-like tentacles popping out at us as we constantly loop around and backtrack, trying to find our way up to the main boss of this dungeon, Baronade. Along the way, we pick up the extremely useful boomerang in this dungeon, a weapon which is not only good in attack, but one that also allows us to pick up some of those out-of-the-way gold Skulltula tokens as well. Acting as Princess Ruto's personal seat cushion for a large part of this mission, we eventually make our way up to the boss in, a trickier but more underwhelming fight, I would say, from a dramatic set-piece perspective, especially when paired up against the two bosses that came before. Once Baronade has been defeated and the heart taken, Princess Ruto grants us the Sapphire of the Zora, the final sacred stone of water which we needed, which will finally allow us access to the Sacred Realm. With all of the items now in hand, Link returns to Hyrule Castle, only to see Princess Zelda along with her bodyguard Impa fleeing the city, with the evil Ganondorf not far behind them. When Ganondorf asks Link which way the princess went, Link, suppose fresh off his success over King Dodongo and Baronade, attempts to confront him, only to pretty much get bitch slapped away.
That is what we call a bitch slap. A bitch slap for a bitch.
Thankfully for Link, Zelda did manage to throw the Ocarina of Time to us before riding away, an item that we can use alongside the 3 Sacred Stones inside the Temple of Time in order to access the Sacred Realm. Now, I have to say, I do have pretty divided feelings overall on this segment of the game. On one hand, I do really like the setup in terms of the vision that we saw back at the start of the game, that coming almost full circle, as well as Link returns to the castle, sees the same vision. I really like the 3 dungeons and the boss fights that make up the majority of Link's childhood as well. But that said, that's possibly where the positives end for me and the negatives to this story arc start to appear. Once Link places the 3 stones on the pedestal and pulls the Master Sword from its berth, a vision plays out of the Sage of Light Rauru, explaining to Link that 7 years have passed since he was knocked out by the power of the Master Sword, with Ganondorf taking advantage of that fact by finding his own way into the Sacred Realm thanks to the efforts of Link. There's nothing wrong with the storyline in and of itself, but it's just so formulaic and simple that, it's honestly a little hard to take seriously at times. Rauru tells us that we are the hero of time and that we must find each of the other 5 sages in order to stop Ganondorf, who, he refers to at least as the King of Evil. And, I honestly laughed out loud at this point as, look, I know Nintendo games have historically been geared more towards kids, but, even so, the King of Evil, is that the best we've got here? In a year that saw the release of Metal Gear Solid and, its themes of shadowy government and corporate agencies, as well as the role, biological determinism plays in that game. Also, Half-Life with its illusion of safety, state betrayal by the government as well. Final Fantasy VII, which released a year prior, which covered, innumerable themes such as rampant corporate greed, environmentalism, eco-terrorism, existential identity crisis, grief, loss, and so on. So, I just cannot give the supposed best game of all time a pass on this, Fisher-Price, Barney the fucking dinosaur level of dialogue. I just can't.
Well then, put on your silly faces and let's go!
Once back at the Temple of Time, we run into the mysterious Sheikh, who says that they are the last of Impa's tribe, that being Zelda's former bodyguard. But, a blonde, somewhat feminine-shaped figure from the future, wonder who that could be.
Zelda?
Obviously.
From the temple, I really wanted to go after the horse Epona at this stage, now that I was an adult. But even though I'd learned her song as a kid and found her in the paddock as an adult over at Lon Lon Ranch, I just couldn't figure out a way to get her out of the ranch. So, bar following a detailed walkthrough, I unfortunately had to give up my idea of, having her as my trusty steed throughout the rest of the game. Soon after my failure in obtaining Epona, I picked up the hook shot from Kakariko's graveyard, as well as learning the Song of Storms in the Windmill as well, but I'm not quite sure what this dude was supposed to be doing, in fairness.
No, you can't unsee it. It's nightmare fuel.
From Kakariko Village, it was time to tackle our first dungeon as a fully fledged adult, with old pal Mido here still thinking he's some kind of Chuck Norris Cub Scout hybrid blocking our path.
Oh, the fuck out of my face.
Some of the enemy AI in this forest area could use some work as well.
How can you not see that?
Making our way into the Forest Temple, the first adult dungeon of the game, and I can honestly say this was my favourite temple of the entire adventure. This and probably the Spirit Temple a close second, but I thought the game arguably peaked at this point. You know, the Forest Temple, it's incredibly well designed in its kind of looping architecture all the way back to the connected main elevator room. It's visually striking in parts as well, with those twisting hallways and, you know, a solid puzzle design to boot. And on top of all this, and arguably the cherry on the cake, is the fact that it probably has the best boss fight in the entire game as well, against Phantom Ganon. So, you know, to say I was a fan of the Forest Temple would be a bit of an understatement. Not far into the Forest Temple, we pick up the bow and arrow, which will prove to be an especially useful item for us for the rest of the game, especially when given upgrades. Defeating the 4 Poe Sisters here gives us access to the temple elevator in the centre of the dungeon, which will take us down to the boss of this area, Phantom Ganon. A really interesting boss fight, and one that was a relic from the early days of Zelda 64's development, as we stated back at the start. Despite it being one of the oldest design levels in the game, the Phantom Ganon fight was still arguably the best, with its, you know, mysterious doppelganger shifting paintings routine, plus Mario Tennis-esque lightning sequences as well, showing just how fluid and fun this game can be when at its best, with not only the gameplay excelling, but, you know, also the overall ambience and atmosphere as well. Once Phantom Ganon has been defeated and sent off to some remote dimension, Link is transported back to the Sacred Realm, where it turns out that his old childhood friend Saria, the girl who gave us the fairy Ocarina back at the start of the game, is actually the Forest Sage. Soon after this, the new Great Deku Tree confirms that we're not actually a Kokiri at all, shock horror, but actually a Hylian.
No shit.
Yeah, no shit. The Fire Temple is our next port of call, but not without first picking up the highly useful Goron Tunic, a fire-resistant robe that effectively disables the time limit otherwise placed on us within the Fire Temple due to that excessive heat. Also nice that it comes in this ultra-chic vermilion colour as well. Turns out the Gorons are in trouble once again, with Darunia now seeking our aid in freeing his captured people from the Fire Temple. The Fire Temple certainly wasn't as much fun as the Forest Temple was for me, or as well designed either, as the constant search for these trapped Gorons, 9 in all, can get a little bit tedious. Thankfully though, we can pick up another highly effective weapon in this dungeon, the Megaton Hammer, a weapon that I used often throughout the game, including in the final battle against Ganondorf as well. Getting to the final boss of this dungeon, the Great Dragon Volvagia, plays out effectively like a game of whack-a-mole, with the dragon appearing and disappearing out of 9 separate holes in the centre of the arena, which you have to use the Megaton Hammer in which to whack him as he reappears. Once back in the Sacred Realm, Darunia, who now turns out to be the Fire Sage, awards us with his medallion and states our power has now grown as a result. This is probably my third and final major issue with Ocarina of Time, the complete lack of narrative power progression in the game. You're constantly told throughout the adventure, after every dungeon, that seeking out the sages and adding their power to yours will make you stronger, but that just isn't the case, with the narrative and the mechanical systems of the game failing to mesh whatsoever. While it sounds good on paper and makes sense from a plot perspective, there simply is no power progression in Ocarina of Time from finding these medallions. You're effectively as strong at your first dungeon as an adult as you are in your 6th, as the medallions themselves add 0 despite being told consistently to the contrary. This is a shame, and really the developer should have either dodged this narrative completely, you know, saying something along the lines of the medallions will open up the path to Ganondorf, something that actually happens near the end of the game, or make the Great Fairy Fountain rewards the medallion rewards, you know, transfer Din's Fire or the Super Spin Attack and so on into the main narrative instead, as those things actually do make the player stronger. But the way it's written as is, constantly reminding the player of their increased power without any noticeable change, is a bit of a head scratcher. Speaking of great fairy fountains, now that we've found the Megaton Hammer, we can locate our fourth fountain up in Death Mountain Crater, with the prize this time being our magic meter getting doubled, which, again, something that would have made far more narrative sense if this had been a reward for finishing the dungeon instead of, again, like we said, effectively nothing. Our next stop on the journey is the Ice Cavern, with the lands of the Zora now being completely frozen over due to the machinations of the evil Ganondorf. The Ice Cavern is a mandatory mini-dungeon due to it containing the Iron Boots, an item which we'll need for the much maligned Water Temple later on. However, if we also take the blue fire from this cavern and use it to free King Zora, he will award us with the very handy Zora Tunic, a robe that will allow us to breathe underwater inside the Water Temple, once again removing the time limit for us in that dungeon. And, it also helps that it comes in this rather fetching cerulean shade of blue, which, you get the picture. This guy seems to like our new robe at least.
Hello, old-timer.
The Water Temple is without doubt the most infamous, notorious dungeon in the entire game, being famous among, even previous non-Zelda players such as myself. The Water Temple itself is made up of a central pillar surrounded by numerous hallways that, jut off around its sides. Within these flooded hallways are, giant stone blocks, bombable walls, as well as some fairly crafty puzzles as well. But it's the water level itself that will no doubt give you the most trouble in this dungeon. On the surface, everything seems pretty straightforward from the start. You're thinking just raise the water up to its highest level, but you actually have to raise and lower the water several times, both up and down, in order to access different areas of the temple, and it's incredibly easy to lose track and, forget where and what you were doing. On top of this, these super irritating little shites called Tactites show up, like from Death Mountain, where they appeared previously, and these guys, while not hard whatsoever, are super fucking annoying, often waiting at the top of sheer drops or jumps that only serve to push you back over the edge. Not long into the dungeon, we once again meet up with Ruto, who once again reminds us of her marriage proposal to her that she made in Jabu Jabu's belly.
It smells like fish.
Making our way through the temple, we eventually come to what's called the Serene Pool, an area of the dungeon that gives off a really cool, otherworldly vibe, and a place where, similar to something like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, we're forced to fight a dark clone version of ourselves. This fight kind of came out of nowhere as well, and seeing as this was my very first Zelda game, I had absolutely no context whatsoever for this fight. While the battle itself was no doubt cool with our dark twin matching her every move, it definitely would have been nice to get some kind of backstory, however brief, on Dark Link here. The boss of the dungeon itself, though Morpha, was a bit of a letdown, with you having to constantly hookshot his eye from the water tendrils he continually shoots out. It's not a particularly hard fight, just, a fairly tedious one. Returning to Kakariko Village, picking up the fire arrows along the way, sees the shadow monster Bongo Bongo again. Sometimes hard to take Ocarina of Time seriously. Escape from the nearby well, knocking Link unconscious in the process. With Bongo Bongo fleeing to the nearby Shadow Temple, which will be our next port of call, we can first drop down the well itself, where we can pick up the Lens of Truth, which makes invisible objects and enemies appear visible, as well as nabbing an ultra-rare golden rupee also. Woohoo! The money situation in Ocarina of Time is another puzzling aspect of the game's design as well. I mean, from early on in the game, you'll acquire money at a pretty steady rate, and especially after you acquire the Giant's Wallet from the House of Skulltula quest, you'll have more cash than you'll know what to do with. But there really is very little to spend your money on in Ocarina of Time. Bar the magic beans, which are quite expensive and also entirely optional, I had pretty much 500 rupees, the max allowed for almost the entire game, with shops being almost non-existent. Reaching the Shadow Temple, a temple-based obstacle course on steroids pretty much, we can pick up our final set of boots, the hover boots, as well as fight mini-boss Dead Hand for the second time, a boss we previously encountered in the abandoned well, with Dead Hand's enemy design arguably being one of the strongest in the game. Once we catch up with Bongo Bongo himself, a name like I said I do find hard to take seriously, we managed to overcome him with a couple of arrows to the hands, as well as a sword swipe to his exposed eye, a method that will be made much trickier if you didn't pick up the Lens of Truth from earlier. Zelda's bodyguard Impa shows up as the new Sage of Shadow this time around, and after receiving her medallion, we have only one further temple to complete before the showdown against Ganondorf commences. Unlike the other temples spread throughout the game, the Spirit Temple is not so easy to access, requiring us to make it through the Gerudo Fortress, a fortress of super fit all-female bandits who seemingly like to walk around half naked and take their male captives prisoner.
That's hot.
Sneaking our way through the fortress, as well as running into some of the harder enemies in the game and these bandits as well, we next need to traverse the highly inhospitable haunted wasteland, a section of desert that, if you haven't picked up the Lens of Truth by this point, you may want to go back and rectify that. The desert is effectively a blind maze with the Lens of Truth showing you a path through it via a ghost. Our goal here is to get to the Desert Colossus where the Spirit Temple is located in, but just before the entrance comes into view, we can find the fifth of the game's great fairy fountains here in a region of desert just off to the right. The prize this time around is Naryu's Love, a highly beneficial spell which will grant us complete invulnerability for a short time, a spell that, as you can imagine, comes in incredibly handy against some of the trickier bosses in the game. Making our way into the Desert Colossus itself, it turns out that Adult Link is effectively blocked from doing a whole lot here, as he needs young Link to make it through the west wing of the temple in order to pick up a vital piece of gear that he needs for the east wing. This is the only temple in the game that requires both Child Link and Adult Link to navigate, so it's off back to the Temple of Time in order to switch back to the younger version of ourselves. There's some really nice atmospheric touches in Ocarina of Time as well, like despite it being the middle of the day here, if you approach Hyrule Castle, which is now Ganondorf's castle, the sky will darken and the aura around it will get noticeably chiller. A really nice touch in terms of creating a suitable level of dread. Once we make it back to the Spirit Temple, we run into Naburo, the de facto leader of the Gerudo bandits and second only in command to Ganondorf himself. However, she says that she doesn't quite trust her leader's intentions and offers to work with us instead in order to bring him down. Making it through the west wing of the temple and grabbing the silver gauntlets, we see Naburo get captured soon after by Kume and Kotake, two old crones who are supposedly the surrogate mothers of Ganondorf. Now that we have the silver gauntlets for ourselves, we can finally move the huge stone that has been blocking the eastern wing of the temple, as well as any other stones or blocks that are in our path for the rest of the game. Like I said earlier, behind only the Forest Temple, the Spirit Temple was probably my favourite dungeon of the game. Again, mainly because of its overall design and puzzle structure, with the light bouncing off the newly acquired mirror shield that we pick up here being, a particularly nice graphical touch. But the boss of this arena plays a huge role in that high ranking as well. Kume and Kotake finally morph into the boss twin Rova here once we reach the summit of the temple, and they will fire both ice and fire spells at us constantly throughout this fight, with us having to not only block their attacks but also direct that fire into the enemy sister's path as well. This is a really fun fight and might well be the best designed fight in the entire game, using an enemy's own attack against them, as both sisters remain vulnerable throughout the fight to the other one's attack. Once both sisters are down, a funny little interaction takes place between the two of them where they don't actually realise that they're dead, arguing and bickering between the two of them as they make their way up to the great skybox in the sky. Once the sisters have been defeated, Naburo, who has now been freed from their enchantment, will grant us the Spirit Medallion, the final one of the game, and, one which will allow us to finally take on Ganondorf. Once back at the Temple of Time, Sheik comes back and reveals that she's actually Zelda.
Shocked. We're all shocked.
Before giving us the light arrows, the only weapon outside of the Master Sword itself which is able to actually do any damage to Ganondorf, who then promptly shows up and kidnaps her. From there, the Sage of Light Rauru combines the full power of all the sages in order to create a light bridge to Ganondorf's castle, which would remain an impassable hurdle otherwise. Ganondorf's castle is made up of 6 areas, each containing a seal which we must destroy in order to gain access to the central tower where Ganondorf himself resides. Combing our way through the various seal chambers in order to unlock them, we can come across the golden gauntlets here, an item that will allow us to throw aside the giant black obelisks in this area, one of which houses the last of the great fairy fountains as well. with the final one giving us double health, which, again, is extremely handy at this point of the game. Once the various seals have been broken and the central tower accessed, it's time to take the fight to Ganondorf himself, although making sure to change back into my Superfly Viridian threads beforehand. The climb to the summit of Ganondorf's tower is superbly well crafted as well, with the eerie organ music in the background consistently growing louder and, giving off an otherworldly and almost ominous vibe as you steadily make your way to the top of the tower. Once at the top, the final boss awaits, with this fight playing out very much like the Phantom Ganon fight from before, although with a few notable exceptions. Ganondorf will take the centre of the room and continually hurl lightning bolts at us, with a combination of, return serve and light arrows being enough for us to gain the upper hand in the fight, although all without the help of Navi, who will be sidelined for this fight, meaning no lock-on. Once Ganondorf has been defeated, the entire tower starts to collapse around us, and you have about 3 minutes to make it out of there with Zelda before you're both crushed. This isn't a particularly difficult challenge, although Zelda's fairly pedestrian pace, plus the Stalfos who randomly pop up as well, can make it tighter than it needs to be if you're not precise. Once Zelda and Link manage to escape the tower, the final boss of the game shows up, or should I say its final form, as Ganondorf has now been transformed into Demon Ganon, a monstrous, huge, multi-weapon beast. Not only does he have to face this monstrosity in single combat, but Link also gets his Master Sword pelted away at the start of the fight as well to add further insult to injury, but thankfully I still had the Megaton Hammer on hand with which to take him on. Unfortunately, despite his massive size and presence in the final fight, Demon Ganon requires little more than strafing left and right during the first phase of his attack in order to get the best of him, with the second phase, once you get your Master Sword back, being even easier, simply requiring you to roll through his legs as he marches towards you. Despite the letdown of the actual boss battle itself, the Demon Ganon fight is still somewhat impressive from a set-piece perspective, but, it's just a shame that they couldn't match what they pulled off earlier during the Phantom Ganon and Twin Rover fights. Once it's all over and Demon Ganon has been sealed away in the void, Link is sent back to his own timeline by Zelda, but returns to see her once again in his own timeline right at the end of the game, presumably to warn her of Ganondorf. I'm not entirely sure how to interpret the final credits, to be fair. Again, this is my first Zelda game, so go easy on me down in the comments below if I did miss something. But yes, if you have more insight regarding this ending, make sure and drop it down in the comments below. That said, the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is now officially being completed by myself, so time to wrap this up and give my final thoughts on whether this N64 classic still holds up today. Look, there's no point in even attempting to say that this game doesn't hold up. It's considered one of the greatest games for a reason, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time with it, especially from a technical and visual standpoint. The almost revolutionary lock-on mechanic of Navi to, the seamless fluidity of first-person to third-person combat, the Ocarina itself as well, which, had never been seen in a video game before, the facial animations in-game as well, which honestly convey a depth of emotion that blocky N64 characters really had no right of being able to do. On top of that, the world of Hyrule itself is absolutely rife with things to do, secrets to find, interesting weapons to wield, making this easily one of the greatest adventure games ever made. And that's why it's so frustrating in a way that Nintendo were able to create all of this technical and visual marvel and, arguably slip up on the easy stuff. A few less minigames plus a few more shops could have balanced out the gameplay somewhat. Switching the Great Fairy Fountain rewards to medallion rewards could have made the narrative make a lot more sense as well, especially from a power progression perspective, continually telling the player that they're now stronger than ever after each dungeon, where in fact there's been absolutely no change, just doesn't make any sense. And it could have all been sidestepped so easily as well. It's just baffling from a narrative and story perspective. And finally, while I did berate the aiming mechanics from earlier on in this review, this was still a 5th generation title at the end of the day, so, its limited functionality in that department can be somewhat forgiven. What can't be so easily forgiven, however, is the almost complete lack of backstory and character development on offer here, and the almost puerile dialogue at times as well. You know, I've pumped 30 odd hours into this game at this point, and I still know next to nothing about Ganondorf's history. You know, apart from one brief sentence that says he was raised by the Gerudo, his motivations are left completely absent as well. You know, he's an evil man. We get that. But surely the player deserves a bit more than that. You know, the manual tells us next to nothing regarding his backstory either, saying that, you know, once again, he is a sinister man who comes from the desert. And of course that he desires the Triforce. That just isn't good enough for a game that many people regard as the greatest game of all time. There's no question that The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time belongs on the pedestal of some of the greatest games ever made. Its technical achievements alone warrant a place on that list, but the outright greatest game of all time? You know, you simply have to offer more in terms of character depth and narrative design, you know, to warrant that kind of title, in my opinion. Two areas that Ocarina of Time is unfortunately severely lacking in. That said, this is still an absolutely fantastic experience, and saying does it still hold up is, you know, almost made redundant as a result, and I would urge anyone with even a passing interest to go back and experience this game as it was in 1998, as, you know, it is and will remain a timeless classic. Let me know your own guys' thoughts on The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time down in the comments below. What are your own memories of playing this absolute titan of a game, and where do you rank it personally on the pantheon of greatest games ever made? The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is on my to-do list in the very near future on this channel, so tune in for that, as it'll be interesting to see if that experience matches up to this one. With that said, as always, thanks for watching, stay safe, and until the next one, hauling out.